Hello, my name is Anouk Nijs, and in the next couple of minutes I will talk to you about a study I did on guided exploration through the duty factor of the dual axis model for running styles. So what is this all about? Well, recently a paper was published which introduced the dual axis framework. This framework states that the running style of a runner at a certain speed can be described using only two parameters. I will shortly explain to you how this works. The dual axis framework starts with the center of mass of the runner. While running, the center of mass has a roughly sinusoidal trajectory. This sinus can be divided in a horizontal component and a vertical component. The horizontal component is mostly dependent on the step length or the cadence of the runner at a certain speed, and the vertical component depends on the ratio of the stance time over flight time. In the dual axis framework, the horizontal and vertical component of the center of mass trajectory are depicted on the two axes, hence the name dual axis framework. The combination of the two axes puts the runner at a certain location in the dual axis framework, and this location is associated with a certain running style. In this way, the dual axis framework can be used to describe the current running style of a runner. But it would be very helpful if we could use this framework to coach runners. In order to do this, we would need to give instructions on both of the axes. For the horizontal axis, so the cadence, there are several methods available, most prominently auditory pacing. With auditory pacing, you provide the runner with a certain beat and they can synchronize their steps to this beat. But for the vertical axis, there is no such method readily available. Let's take a closer look at the vertical axis. The vertical axis is actually defined by the duty factor. This is done because the ratio of stance over flight time would become infinite in the absence of a flight time, which happens, for example, during walk. Most studies that looked at the duty factor, stance time, or flight time have compared different runners in their natural running style or runners over different speeds, which also affects the duty factor. But nobody has really looked at a change within a person at a certain speed. So in our study, we wanted to see if people can change the ratio of stance to flight time based on verbal instruction. We used 4 different instructions so that we could both look at a difference on the instruction on flight time or instruction on stance time, and instructions that would lead to an increase in the duty factor and instructions that would lead to a decrease in the duty factor. For every instruction, participants completed a training block in a repeated measures design. A training block started with a baseline measurement in which no instruction was given and they were told to run normally. Then there were 3 training trials in which they tried to follow the instruction and received feedback on the parameter the instruction was given on, so either flight or stance time, after the trial. And finally, we ended with a performance trial in which participants also tried to follow the instruction. During the first minute of each trial, auditory pacing at their preferred cadence was present, but there was no specific instruction regarding this pacing. In addition, the baseline and performance trials had a minute without pacing present. We call this the continuation. We calculated the average duty factor for all baseline and performance trials and used paired sample t-test to compare them for each instruction, and found that the change in duty factor was significant for all instructions. But is one instruction better than the others? In order to check this, we calculated the improvement in the duty factor. So this is the difference between the baseline and the performance trial in the direction of the instruction. We use repeated measures ANOVA to compare the different instructions. We did not find a difference between instructions to change the stance time or to change the flight time. And we also didn't find a significant difference on instructions aimed at lowering the duty factor or aimed at increasing the duty factor. Based on this, you might want to say that all instructions are similar, but there is still a way in which the instruction could have an effect that is different than the effect we intended it to have. How does this work? If you give someone the instruction to increase their stance time, there are actually multiple ways in which they can achieve this. One way, and the one we intend, is to increase the stance time while keeping the step time constant, leading to a decrease in flight time. This would purely affect the duty factor. The other method is to increase the stance time, but also increase the step time. In this method, not only the duty factor, but also the cadence is affected. In the dual axis framework, this means that the change is not only in the vertical direction, but also in the horizontal direction. So we plotted the location of the baseline and performance trials in the dual axis framework. Each line starts at the baseline and ends at the performance, which is represented by the dot. In these figures, you see this for the instructions that were aimed towards the top of the model. As you can see, most participants were able to keep the change mainly in the vertical direction, but some had a serious change in the horizontal direction as well. In these figures, you see the same thing, except now for the instructions towards the bottom of the model. And we see a similar result. Most people, mainly in the vertical direction, some a large change in the horizontal direction. In order to see if the different instructions had different effects on the cadence, we calculated the absolute change in cadence for each instruction. And we did this both for the minute with pacing and for the minute without pacing, as pacing is known to influence cadence as well. We again used the repeated measures ANOVA to compare the different instructions, and again did not find a difference between instructions to change the stance time and instructions to change the flight time. We also didn't find a significant difference between instructions towards a lower duty factor and instructions towards a higher duty factor, but we did find a significant difference between the minutes with pacing and the minutes without auditory pacing, which we called the continuation. As you can see in the figure, the absolute change in cadence is higher in the continuation phases, which indicates that the presence of the pacing reduced the absolute change in cadence. Based on our results, we made a couple of conclusions. People are able to change the duty factor based on the verbal instruction to change their stance or flight time, but the different instructions did not have different effects, so they were all effective. And finally, the presence of pacing, so auditory pacing, decreases the absolute change in cadence, which is brought on by the instructions. So for practice, this means that instruction to change the stance or flight time in combination with auditory pacing to control the cadence can be used to guide runners through the dual axis framework. Thank you for your attention and feel free to contact me if you have any questions.